Hello chess lovers, Suren here, and in this video I would like to share with you a fantastic game played by Garry Kasparov against Viktor Korchnoi. This game was played in 1995 in Horgen, which is a municipality in Switzerland. Now let's see what happened on the board. Kasparov had white pieces and he started the game with knight f3, knight f6 by Korchnoi, c4, e6, knight c3, d5, d4, c6. The game is transformed into a semi-Slav defense, and bishop g5. We see the anti-Maran Gambit h6. Korchnoi is choosing the Moscow variation, and bishop h4. Earlier the same year Kasparov had chosen bishop takes f6 continuation, but this time he chooses a sharp bishop h4 move, which involves a pawn sacrifice. This is the anti-Moscow variation, where in return for the pawn, white receives a lead in development and a strong initiative. D takes c4, e4, and bishop b4. Korchnoi avoids fighting against Kasparov in sharp theoretical lines, which could arise with g5. Thus he prefers a less popular bishop b4 move. Now comes bishop takes c4 and bishop takes c3. Korchnoi is voluntarily exchanging the important bishop, but this gives white a huge advantage. Black should have played the principled g5 move, and then knight takes e4. But in the game after bishop takes c4, we see bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and queen a5. This should have been the point. Both c3 and e4 pawns are vulnerable. But without paying attention to black's threats, Kasparov simply castled kingside. Right now both pawns are hanging. Black proceeded with knight takes e4, but if a move like queen takes c3, then white could capture on f6 and then play rook c1. If queen a5, then d5. White is managing to gain a dangerous attack. In the game after castling kingside, we see knight takes e4 and knight e5. Kasparov is placing his knight on the central square and is opening up the queen's diagonal. At the same time, white is allowing black to win one more pawn. Here it becomes clear that white has stopped counting pawns and fully concentrates himself on the unpleasant attack. Knight d7, well, but let's just have a look. What if, for example, knight takes c3, then white can play queen g4, if g6 then queen f3, if rook h7 then bishop d3. The threat is knight takes f7, and if a move like queen c7 then knight takes g6, and this is going to be a destructive attack. Let's go back. In the game after knight e5 we see knight d7, queen g4 and g5. Well, if knight takes e5 then white can recapture, if queen takes e5 then rook e1, and black is in trouble. Here f5 can be met with queen g6 check. In the game after queen g4, that's why we see g5, queen takes e4, knight takes e5. Well, if g takes h4, then knight takes f7 is very strong. That's why after queen takes e4 we first see knight takes e5, and only after d takes e5 Korchnoi won the bishop on h4. Rook b1. Now if we have a look at the position, kingside castling is out of the question for black, and also with his last move white attacked the pawn on b7, not allowing black to play bishop d7 and castle queenside. So one thing is obvious, that black king is trapped in the middle of the board, and this can become very dangerous for black. White's compensation is all too obvious. h3. By the way, if a move like queen takes c3, then white can play rook d1. If rook g8, then queen takes h4. If rook g5, then rook d3, and then white can double up the rooks on d file. Black is in trouble, guys. That's why after rook b1 we see h3. Korchnoi is trying to create some counter-playing chances, but now comes rook d1. Kasparov is not paying attention what's going on in here. Rook g8. Well, if h takes g2, of course white won't recapture. White will use this pawn as a shield and can play rook d3. If rook g8, then queen h7. If rook f8, then queen g7, and then rook d1. Again, black is in trouble, guys. After rook d1 we see rook g8. Now comes g3 and rook g5. Well, if queen takes c3, then white can play rook b3 and then rook d3. Again, always this doubling up the rooks on d file is becoming very problematic for black. And then queen takes h6. Right now the threat is rook d8 check, and if bishop d7 then simply rook takes d7, and again this is going to be an easy win for white. After g3, that's why we see rook g5. Black is starting to put pressure on e5, but simply f4 is on the board. Black rook again retreated back on its initial g8 square, and bishop f1. Of course Kasparov could also play rook d6 and then rook d1, but he's not hurrying, he's simply playing bishop f1 coming after the pawn on h3. Queen takes c3, bishop takes h3, f5, queen e2. Of course, instead of queen e2, capturing en passant was also playable, but in the game we see queen e2. Now white queen will join the attack from the h5 square. King f8, queen h5, queen c5 check. Well, if I move like king g7, then white has a very powerful move. Can you find a winning move for white? Ready? Actually, rook takes b7 is winning on the spot. If bishop takes b7, then rook d7 check, and then queen f7 checkmate. In the game after queen h5, we see queen c5 check, king h1, queen e7, and finally rook d6 is on the board. Now the second rook will also come. King g7, we have reached the critical position, and now you can pause the video and try to find Kasparov's next move. Ready? In this position, Garry Kasparov went for bishop takes f5 sacrifice. Look at this. Queen f7, well, if he takes f5, then simply queen takes h6 check, and then queen h5, and then rook g6, and then rook f6. Black is losing his queen, and the game is over. Black king will soon get checkmated. In the game after bishop takes f5, we see queen f7. Black is offering an exchange of queens in order to simplify the position, but there is no way out. Queen takes f7, king takes f7, and in this position Kasparov made a move and black resigned. Can you find his next move? Ready? This time he played bishop takes e6 and Korchnoi resigned. If bishop takes e6, then the bishop is no longer protecting the pawn on b7. White can capture on b7 and then on e6, and this rook endgame is hopeless for black. That's why after bishop takes e6 check, Korchnoi resigned. Also, please note that during this game, Korchnoi didn't even manage to make a move with his queenside bishop and rook. This was simply an awesome attack by Garry Kasparov. He just gave his opponent no chance to survive and simply blew apart Korchnoi's army. Thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this game. For more games, consider subscribing to my channel. I will see you in the next video.